In this video, we're going to be replacing the starter in this 2005 Honda Element.
Our negative terminal here, 10mm nut. Go ahead and back that off now. And set that aside. So now here's your knock sensor. What we're going to do is reach up and in there and unplug it. And then with a 28mm socket, a swivel, and an extension, so once you get your knock sensor loose, you should be able to take your tool out, reach in there and spin it out by hand. These typically will come out pretty easily once they're broken free. There's your knock sensor. And again, that's just located right behind your starter on the engine block. So we have our ratchet with a 14mm socket on the top bolt of our starter. Very hard to see, but if you reach around the top of your starter, you can feel a long bolt about 3/4 of the way back on the starter body. So we have a socket on there now. We're going to try and remove that bolt. It's a little tight to work, but you can get on there. Once you've got it loosened up enough, you can go ahead and take your tool out. So go ahead and remove your tool. You should be able to reach in there and unthread the rest of the bolt by hand. So our socket stayed in there. We're just going to remove the socket and our extension. There's your bolt. It's going to be a long bolt, and it's going to be threaded to a portion, and there'll be a stop on it. We've got the top bolt out, so now we're going to go for the bottom bolt. It's going to be a 17mm. Alright, so now that we have the bolt loosened up, you just back that bolt out. A little bit of room to work with the ratchet. It'll take some time. If you can get it loose enough to where you can move it by hand, that might be the option. It's a little quicker. So up on the top of the back of the starter, there is a harness that has a clip to a bracket on the starter. You're just going to get in there with a panel tool and pop that clip off. There we go. Just pop that harness off of the starter. Now with our starter free, we have a little bit more room to work, and we're not going to be putting any tension on that harness. Now we'll work on getting our starter out of the motor. So your starter is now free. You have the harness on the back of it removed. If you can reach up in there and wiggle your starter free, go ahead and do that and pull it back and down. If your starter does not want to move and refuses to move for you, what you can do is come in with a piece of 2x4 to the back of the starter here and tap the other end with a rubber mallet or hammer, and that'll break free your starter. Now our starter is actually loose at this point. So what we're going to do is start to work it out of the vehicle. So we've spun it to a point now where we can see the plug on the top. We have two things on the top. We have a plug and we have our power positive connection. positive connection is going to be held in by a 12mm bolt, and our plug here should just be a pull to remove, like so. It's basically just a push terminal at the end. So we're just going to continue to work our starter out, and as we gain access to those different pieces, we'll remove them. There it is. So that's the angle that you're going to need to take it out and put it in with. All right, so right now we're just stuck on this little lip here. And we also have on the top our power cable. So we're going to maneuver this into a position we can get to our cable, which will be this position here. Here's our power. Just remove this rubber insulating cover. There's your 12mm bolt. We'll take that off now. At this point, your starter is completely free other than this cable. So when you release this cable, be careful not to drop the starter out. You want to make sure you retain this nut and the washer if there is one. Nope. There's a chance your new starter doesn't come with one. You'll have an extra just in case. So now we can work our starter out between the subframe and the oil pan. So we're going to start by grabbing a hold of this harness here, which has our power wire, our other plug here, and our other plug on top. All right, so those are all going to get connected to our starter, but we're going to start this job by holding them away to the side. So let's go ahead and feed it like this with the power facing. Let's take our nut and our two washers off. We can put our power cable on. We're going to want to return our two washers. And nut. All right, so once you get your nut started on your power cable, go ahead and snug that up the best you can, and then we'll come back and tighten it down. Now, just find a position to work in that you're comfortable. That's one of the hardest things to do in this job here. So we're going to snug it up and give it an extra quarter turn, and we're good with that. To finish that power cable, I'm just going to put that rubber insulator back on. Now if you remember the removal, we had to use a tool to remove the rubber insulator, so you want to make sure that's on there really well. are. So right here you have one more connection. This is going to be your spade terminal connection. So inside here you just have one blade that's going to go inside here. It's going to be a flat blade. So you're going to need to make sure you're lined up. There we go. So the blade is sideways. All right, we're connected there, we're plugged in. That's it for connections on our starter. Now we're going to have to angle the back side in, up into the intake, and then angle it down into the motor. Now with your power wire connected and your other terminal connected here, you will be fighting them a little bit, which means when you're pushing your starter up, you're going to be pushing against this harness. So you're going to have to move this harness out of the way to get your starter to go up and under this harness, like that. So the name of the game here is to get the back of your starter up as high as it will go to get the front cleared of this area here. Now, on the back side of your starter here, you'll have a lower radiator hose in this housing. On the other side of this housing, where your starter is basically pushing up against, is another coolant hose. I'm going to be sure not to puncture that with the bracket hanging off the back of the starter. Okay, so if you can see that angle, that's where you need to be to get your starter this far, which means we're almost there. All right. So now that we have the starter into the area it's going to be in, we can start to align our bolt holes and the actual snout of the starter into the flywheel. So what you may find is that it fits and drops right into position. And sometimes you have to kind of wiggle it around a little bit. There are teeth on the gear of the starter on the front that match up with the flywheel. You may have a little issue getting those to line up, but once you get it lined up, you can start to thread in your bolts. So these two bolts are going to be kind of tricky. Just take your time. They are definitely doable. All right, so there's one. So you want to line up the center of where your bolt goes through on the starter with this. There's a little rib that'll give you the center line of where that bolt comes through the housing. You'll line those up the best you can. And before we go any further, we're going to drive this bolt in and get it somewhat tight, but still to where we're able to move the starter if we need to spin it on the back bolt. So our front bolt is in, our starter is in and snugged up but not tight, which will allow us to rotate the starter if we need to. So now we can install our back bolt, which is just going to be reaching up around the back and going by feel to get this bolt in. So now what I'm going to try and do is get in there with a 14 millimeter on an extension onto the head of the bolt. See if I can get it snugged up, or at least most of the way in by hand, before we go ahead and fish a tool in there. Now that you've got it tightened, go ahead and take your tool out. There we go. Make sure you give your starter a little wiggle. Make sure it doesn't move around. If you do have any play in there, give it a little tap. Make sure it's actually snugged up nice and tight. Again, if you follow your starter towards the driver's side of the vehicle, you look on your subframe, there's a motor mount. If you look straight up, you can see the flange where it mounts up to. I can see here, at least on this side, that we're nice and flush. Can't see the other sides, just give it a wiggle, make sure you're in there. If you're good, that's it. We can move on to putting our knock sensor back in. So our knock sensor now is going to go into the block. Like that. And then we have our harness here. Before we plug in our knock sensor, we'll go ahead and torque it down to 23 foot-pounds. Okay. Now we can remove our socket and plug in our knock sensor. So now that you have your knock sensor plugged in, all we're going to do here in the last step is take your harness, wrap it around that metal bracket of the starter, and plug that clip into the starter. When you do that, just give the other plugs a quick look. Make sure you didn't pull them out. If everything looks good, you're all set. Reconnect our negative terminal and make sure it's down as far as it'll go. And tighten up our nut. Because that's an odd angle, I had a ratchet nearby just to make sure we're tight. Looks good.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.